Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is Wolfenstein the Old Blood? It's an expandalone for my favorite game of 2014, which was, of course, Wolfenstein The New Order by Machine Games, and these are my first impressions based on about 3 hours or so of gameplay, which takes you just over halfway through this 5 to 6 hour experience, depending on how quick you are. So, what's it all about? Well, it's $20 worth of more Wolfenstein, set in 1946. It's a different mission going on prior to all of the stuff that happens within Wolfenstein The New Order, which causes Blazkowicz to end up in the 60s, where the Nazis dominate the world. And, of course, that results in a massive globe-trotting adventure. And by globe-trotting, I really do mean that. It goes all over the world with some fantastic set pieces, great level design, and a wide variety of locales. I think is maybe one of the strongest parts of that game. You just went everywhere, including off the damn planet, which is not what you would necessarily expect from a shooter like this. In fact, the story, while pulpy, was surprisingly well delivered, very well written. You met some very interesting characters, and you were constantly surprised by the places that the game took you next, which I think was a great strength of that particular title. The question is, does Old Blood live up to that? And, I mean, can it? You know, can a $20 expandalone that was made with more limited resources actually live up to the level... Oh, hello. Looks like we have a friend. Can it actually live up to the level of Wolfenstein The New Order? And I think I'm going to horribly die here. We'll see. Well, it can in some ways, certainly. But I would definitely not describe it as anywhere near as good as the original game that it was based on. I just don't think it is. And there are reasons for that. The first reason is exactly what I was describing before. The fact that what really made the original game super special, ouch, was the sheer variety of locations that you would find yourself in. Now, over halfway through the game, I have spent a great deal of time in a castle. Let me put it that way. And I've just got out of the castle and made my way through to this village. So you crawl around a lot of corridors. You crawl around a great deal of corridors, in fact. And you eventually make your way out of the castle, and you find yourself in this village, which is certainly reminiscent of Wolfenstein 2009, I think, in many ways. But up to that point, you're fighting, for the most part, the same set of enemies, and indeed, it introduces you to almost all of the enemies very, very quickly. If you were hoping for new enemy types in this game, well, so far... and perhaps there are more later on, but so far you're fighting mostly the same enemies, with a different troop type that happens to have the Bombenschauss, which is a single-shot bolt-action rifle. So you're going up against snipers, essentially, although there were also sniper-class enemies within the original. It's just these guys look a little bit different and perform a little bit differently. But outside of that, you are, for the most part, fighting the same enemies as you were in Wolfenstein The New Order. And that's made very apparent by the first half an hour or so of the game, which is a series of scripted events, which are then followed up by a stealth sequence, a mandatory stealth sequence, which is not perhaps the strongest part of the game, let me put it that way. You have to sneak around the heavy soldiers, and you have to utilize the power conduits to turn them off and then kill them with melee. Rinse and repeat for an uncomfortable length of time, let me put it that way. Which is really not what I came to expect from Wolfenstein, because in the first game you had a great deal of freedom. Great deal of freedom. You could take most challenges on with stealth, you could go in guns a-blazing, and everything in between. And it worked out really well, because it was a very bombastic game. It really celebrated being over the top in many ways, which sharply contrasted with a surprisingly human set of characters. It had some great villains in it, no doubt about that. I really don't want to shoot him. I'm going to try and avoid doing that. Nope, it actually won't let you. Interesting. Never mind. And it was somewhat over the top. I mean, hell, you can dual-wield assault rifles. Come on. It was ridiculous. It had an old-school health system with some interesting twists. And that was fantastic, because you could overcharge your health and armor, and the faster you killed and the faster you went through the levels, the more you could actually maintain your health and armor rating, which was great. It had an interesting skill tree system and so on and so forth, and they redesigned the perk system in this game. But while there's plenty of shooting action going on here, I have to say that it felt more repetitive, at least up to this point, in comparison to the New Order. Now, is that because I had my fill of the New Order? Maybe. Maybe I've just had my fill of Wolfenstein, and in my opinion, the New Order lasted just as long as it needed to. It didn't outstay its welcome. It was nicely paced. It was as long as I would have hoped a game like that would be. You know, I think I beat it in somewhere between like 14 or 15 hours or something along those lines. And I had a great deal of fun in the process. With Old Blood, it seems like perhaps the pacing's a little bit off. You spend maybe a little bit too much time in Castle Wolfenstein crawling around corridors, fighting the same sort of enemies, and as a direct result, you end up finding yourself pining for the varied locales of the original and the interesting characters. Now, when it comes to interesting characters, the villains are the guys that really, as far as I'm concerned, take the center stage here. They're pretty amusing, they've got good dialogue and some interesting characteristics. But, outside of that, I haven't met too many interesting friendly characters up to this point, and that's mostly because you're on mission, you don't have a home base to come back to. And the home base is what really grounded you within New Order. And it allowed you to experience character development, really interesting dialogue, do little side missions, and so on and so forth. And then you got to go back on your globetrotting adventure to all sorts of different places. I mean, for God's sake, you got to go under the sea, you got to go into space. So much going on with that. Whereas up to this point, it's been, well, there's a castle, and there's a village, and there's a bridge. And the bridge doesn't get destroyed in the cool way that it is in the New Order. And I suppose you can argue that it feels like a bit more of a grounded adventure here. Yeah, sure, why not? I can give you that. It does feel a little bit more grounded, certainly. But in doing that, it lost some of the charm, I would say, of Wolfenstein: The New Order. Now, it's not to say the gunplay doesn't have what it needs to make for a good shooter. In fact, what I would maybe suggest is if you haven't played the original Wolfenstein, maybe it might be a good idea to play this one first, because then your expectations will be tempered by this. And once you go into New Order, you'll find that New Order is a better game than this Expand alone. This will give you a nice little introduction. Now, what I'd have loved to see is the addition of some really interesting new mechanics, but they haven't really done that. They give you this pipe, which allows you to climb up rock faces, and I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but you split the pipe up and you use it to climb up rock face. The problem is there's really nothing to that mechanic. Like, it doesn't add to the game in any real way, frankly. It's just there. It's just present. There's no choices to be made as to whether or not you decide to climb up something. It's always a case of, to progress, you have to climb. And you can peek over ledges and you can shoot people, but there's only a handful of times when you'll really do that. Here's a prime example of how this works. There's no real skill involved in it, and it doesn't really add to the game in any way, as far as I'm concerned, other than giving you a different way to transition. Like, if it was a choice, I could certainly see that being an interesting addition to the game, but it never is a choice. It's always compulsory. So, really, it's just a way to traverse... Get out of it. It's a way to traverse the level that's maybe a little bit different to what they did within New Order, but it doesn't add anything to the game. Now, there's a couple of different weapons, which unfortunately I can't demonstrate because I just took all my bloody weapons away. There's a couple of new weapons. There's a grenade pistol, and there's the single-shot weapon, which kind of replaces the sort of marksman's rifle that you got in the original. And you're stuck with the old stuff. So you're stuck with the old pistol, which doesn't have the burst fire, although it does have the silencers. You're stuck with the old assault rifle, although it performs pretty much as well as it would in the first game anyway. So there's really not a great deal to that. But you're, for the most part, stuck with the same weapons, fighting the same enemies. So, the question becomes, do you want to play more Wolfenstein? And are you okay with it not being a absolutely phenomenal globe-trotting adventure, and it maybe being a little bit more down-to-earth and perhaps a little bit samey? Because if you're looking for more Wolfenstein, this is a decently priced... It is a decently priced entry to the series. It's not a bad game. The problem is you're comparing it to New Order, which was a phenomenal game, whereas this is merely a good expandalone. It's good. It's enjoyable, for the most part. There are occasional sections that annoyed me, such as the forced stealth, but outside of that, it is, for the most part, a solid expandalone. Now, there is something I do want to comment on, which is the performance. Now, we're going to head over to the options menu here. It looks very similar. In fact, it's completely the same as the first game, as far as I know. So you've got the limited resolutions, as I pointed out previously. You don't actually have that many choices in terms of resolutions, which is a little bit unfortunate. And you've got your field of view, which goes all the way up to 100, which is totally satisfactory. And you can do some video customization here under advanced, including a bunch of stuff which, just like last time, is very confusing. It's id Tech 5 specific. So it's like, what is max PPF? I don't know. Do we want to know about the virtual texture cache size? I mean, how high does that have to be? Lord knows. You might notice I have this on high. There's a reason for that. Because performance in this game is actually not as good as I would have hoped. The first game had some performance issues, especially on AMD cards. This version hasn't really improved matters. And I found that since you can't use SLI in this game, a 980 GTX is not enough to run this game in Ultra and stay at 60. And I'd love to say that the game justifies that in terms of its graphical fidelity, but I don't think it does. Texture quality is really not that great, as is unfortunately the case with many of the id Tech 5 games. I say many, there weren't really all that many to begin with. You know, games like Rage didn't really have fantastic quality either. The texture quality just wasn't really there. And it's a bit unfortunate that games choose to use that engine, because it doesn't really seem to have too many obvious advantages. It doesn't have SLI support, it's capped at 60 frames per second, and if you turn it down to high, yeah, it'll run fine enough. But outside of that, I'm not really particularly impressed, frankly, by the performance of it. It's fine enough. It's not the worst, certainly, but it could be better. And that was a problem with the original game, and they haven't fixed any of the issues with the view models either. The weapons are frankly too large, which is unfortunate. You know, it would just be nice to see improvements there. Now, I'm going to actually jump out of this so that we can play around a little bit with the challenge mode, which is a new addition here, and that will allow me to jump through a few challenges, which will let me show you a great deal of shooting. Because I haven't shown you too much. You got to see the stealth section there and the story-based section with the dialogue with the villain, which is always the highlight as far as I'm concerned of these games. It was the same in New Order. It's the same with Old Blood as well. And we're going to run our way through this section here, which is basically a score attack. And it lets you play the same levels over and over again, which, you know, in itself is fine. I certainly don't mind that. I got no problem with that whatsoever, and it gives you a little bit of replayability. Not a huge amount, but a little bit of extra replayability, which I don't really have too many complaints about. It makes up for the fact that they don't have the Enigma codes and different game modes and the timeline-based replayability that was in the original, I suppose. But it's still a solid shooter, overall. It's just maybe a shame that they didn't go far enough with it. I'd have loved to see them bring back the Tesla cannons and the crazy weapons of Return to Castle Wolfenstein. And there's so many teasing references to that game that it disappoints me that we don't have actual gameplay references in terms of the weapon selection. Because you really are stuck for the most part with the same old assault rifles and automatic shotguns. And yeah, the dual wields in there, but there was an opportunity, I think, to make it a little bit more interesting. I think perhaps I'm spoiled by expandalones like Blood Dragon, which really take the game into a whole new place. And that's not what Old Blood is. It is a nice addition to the storyline. It's fleshing out some of the World War II stuff, the old history World War II stuff, which perhaps some people were looking for after playing through the New Order and finding that the vast majority of it was focused on the 60s as opposed to World War II, which actually took maybe less than an hour, probably about an hour of gameplay, I would say. Everything else was pretty much in the 60s. So if you are looking for the World War II experience, it is there. And you've still got the same gunplay. It's still as good as it was, frankly, and it's still as challenging as it ever was. I'm going to switch out to a different challenge here. We can have a fight in the cable car platform. There we go. And these are most of the big set-piece battles, incidentally, which unfortunately just don't really live up to the crazy set pieces that were in Wolfenstein: The New Order. So what's the conclusion? Well, so far, at any rate, and perhaps it's gonna really surprise me towards the end of it. This is, of course, only your first impressions, as always. So far, it's been fun enough with occasional frustrations. It's scratched my itch for a little bit more Wolfy. And that's fine. I hope that it is successful, just in the way that I hope the New Order was successful, because I'd like to see more. I'd love to see Machine Games bring us some more single-player first-person shooters, because they do a damn fine one. And for $20, I wouldn't necessarily have expected the same quality. And you don't get the same quality. But you do get a lot of the same stuff that was offered within Wolfenstein: The New Order. The same old good gunplay, collectible heavy gameplay, you know, there's gold bars to collect and things like that. Although, it's not quite as fun as collecting things within Wolfenstein: The New Order, because you had all sorts of things like those collectible songs and the Enigma codes, and I mean, hell, that game was chock full of collectibles, so there's a little bit less of that here. But, you know, ultimately, it's still a good enough first-person shooter, and hell, as I said, for $20, for about 5 or 6 hours of good solid single-player, along with the challenge mode, it's probably worthy of your time, as long as you temper your expectations accordingly. Do not expect it to be as good as Wolfenstein: The New Order was, because it's not. And that's a little bit of a shame. It doesn't seem like they've really learned anything from that game, but really, was there anything to learn? That game was very, very good. I mean, it really, really was. I had very few nitpicks outside of the technical aspects that I've already mentioned in this game. There weren't that many things wrong with it. There really were not. So what was there to learn? Not a huge amount, but it does seem like in some small respects, in terms of things like set pieces and level design, this game does take a few steps backwards. It is very corridor focused within the first few hours. It does have its set pieces, but they're maybe not as mind-blowing as in New Order. It almost feels like New Order sort of tapped them creatively. And it's not like these are badly designed levels, it's just that they're the kind of levels that I see in other first-person shooters, whereas the sort of stuff that I saw in New Order, I'd never seen that before. And I don't want to spoil the storyline, but for God's sake, you got to go into space. It was fantastic. And you had some really memorable villains and awesome characters, particularly on the friendly side, which unfortunately you really don't get in this one. Bit of a shame. It's more of Blazkowicz on his own, shooting up some Nazis. And if that's all you're looking for, great. Sure. This is good value for what you get, as far as I'm concerned. $20 for about 6 hours of good FPS gameplay is, at least in my opinion, solid. I'm fine with that. Some people won't be, and I can understand that. You know, not everyone believes that $20 for 6 hours of gameplay is worthwhile. I get that. And you're not wrong. I mean, you can't be wrong. A value proposition is a very personal thing. Some people will be okay with it, some people won't be. But it's alright. It's just a shame that it's just good. You know, because Machine Games' last outing was not just good, it was phenomenal. In almost every respect. So this is a bit of a step down. But it's still good. Oh, it's just a little slimy, it's still good. It's just a little samey, it's still good. I'm not going to criticize it too much. It's just, hey, the last one was amazing. This one's really pretty great. It's worth a shot. If you wanted more Wolfy, there's more Wolfy. This is what this is. It's just a shame, because I think maybe it could have been a bit more than that. Just a bit more. Just a little more. Wolfenstein: The Old Blood, ladies and gentlemen. It's available for $20 or your regional equivalent on Steam. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.